Okay. So first off, thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to go through and give folks a quick overview of Archimedes. I won't spend too much time on it, but um, I think not everybody here knows what it is. So give a very quick intro to it and then go into the meat of today's presentation. So at a very high level, Archimedes is a software engineering guild that probably defines us better than anything else. Like the guilds that existed, all the way through to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the focus of our guild is also in helping people, particularly in our case, software developers and engineers, better at what they do. So in the more traditional guilds, if you go back to pre-industrial era, they generally comprise levels like apprentice and then master and then eventually grandmaster, and that's how people got trained and skilled in a particular skill set. So we're trying to build something similar here at Archimedes, and unlike before, we have a few more levels or bands, as we call them. You go from apprentice through to what we call practitioner and coder, and then eventually to the expert and guru levels of the guild. And our goal is to really enable members of the guild to be able to engage, grow, and earn through various mechanisms that we provide. Not going to get into the details of that, but if any of this is interesting to you and you want to talk about it offline, more than happy to do so. And in terms of how our clients or our partners access the guild, they do it through a variety of different ways. They do it through an offering that we call Code as a Service. Essentially, what that is an on-demand task-based offering where, let's say, for example, you have a backlog of cards that you need to get done in Jira or whatever your product management backlog tool might be. You can plug in an Archimedes team in an on-demand manner into that and start clearing up that backlog, and that's used more for burst capacity in some sense. So it's not something that you basically manage all your work through. But let's say you're running up against release deadlines and you need things to get done in a relatively fast manner. Then you can use the Code as a Service offering. Generally, all levels of the guild have the ability to access the Code as a Service offerings. So basically at the apprentice through to the guru level. But for the most part, the folks that get engaged in the Code as a Service offering are the apprentice through to the coder level of the guild. The next offering that we have is something called Consult, where you consult with the expert and the guru levels of the guild on to very specific things. So, for example, if you've deployed an app, a web application, and say you're having performance issues and you want somebody that's an expert or guru level member of the guild to look at that, provide you guidance, best practices, very specific areas of improvement, you can engage with the higher levels of the guild to get you that. And then you can either take that and do what needs to be done to improve things yourself. You can engage Archimedes through the Code as a Service option to do that, or you could do a hybrid approach where some of the tasks coming out of that are done by your team, and some of the tasks that come out of that are handled by Archimedes through Code as a Service. Or in some cases, if you want the expert or the guru themselves to sort of go in and optimize, they can do that. But it really depends on what makes more sense for a client or a partner. In terms of hire, essentially our goal is not to this isn't like Upwork or a marketplace like TopTal or something like that, where basically we prevent people from within the guild to go work for a client or a partner full time. In fact, from our perspective, that's a great outcome. If somebody that you either consult with or that you've engaged with on a Code as a Service model turns out to be someone that you really like working with, then we are more than happy for you to bring them on full time. Depending on the context, we may hire them directly ourselves and then do an employee lease arrangement between the two companies, or you can bring them on directly to your payrolls. But essentially, the idea is not to lock them in and then to have some kind of non-circumvention clause. It's not a marketplace, really, in that sense. So we're not trying to prevent clients and partners from bringing on board guild members to work full time with them. And we built an offering that makes that easy to do. And then the final piece is build, which is generally so the code as a service, the consult, and the higher offerings tend to be for for startups that are more beyond, let's say, the seed through the Series A stage, whereas the build offering tends to be more for startups that are in the pre-seed or sometimes in the incubation stage, where we're building a prototype or an MVP for a startup. And in that context, essentially what we do is what you would think of as an agency doing, except in the whereby they build an MVP. But I think what we do beyond that is allow you the ability to then plug into a code as a service offering to build features and things beyond the MVP, and also plug into our higher offering, where if you like some of the people that are building your MVP and you want to bring them on board full time into your companies, you can do that. So I'm going to stop here for a second and see if anyone has any questions on Archimedes as a guild. If not, I'll move to the most important part of this discussion, at least, which is Umeed and what we've done there. Okay. All right. So in terms of this particular event, essentially, this is a series of talks that I think, Roland, you had a question.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, go ahead, Roland.
So just to clarify, what you're saying basically is that Archimedes is kind of a resource hub that enables startups at any stage of their growth to reach out and leverage Archimedes resources for their development without being tied in long term. Is that right?
Not really, because it really depends on the context, right? If you want to bring in somebody on a more full-time basis, you can, right? And more importantly, I don't think we are looking at us from the point of view of the startup itself as much as we're looking at us ourselves from the point of view of the guild, right? And we are very selective in terms of who we work with. So the guild has a veto on whether or not they want to work with a particular startup or not. So we're not necessarily like, just anyone comes on board, starts working with us. That's not how it works, because that's not in the best interest of our guild members, frankly. So we are very selective in terms of who we work with. And because we have to make sure that from our perspective, right, we have two top priorities. One top priority is to make sure we are able to service our clients and partners the best way possible and give them the best work possible. And the other is to make sure that the guild members are able to cultivate their careers through Archimedes in the way that they want to. And to make both happen, we have to make sure that we are working with the right client partners. Does that make sense?
Yes, certainly does.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, in terms of the engineering mastermind series, we've done a bunch of these talks already, but we've over the summer we really didn't do any. We are kicking them off again, and we're doing them more frequently through the rest of this year as well as into next year. But the YouTube videos of the previous talks are available. I can share them after this call if needed as well. But essentially, it's the YouTube channel is at Archimedes. You can find them there. We also have them on our content website, which is archimedes.dev/4th act. We cover a whole variety of different things in this engineering mastermind series, but generally things that are interesting to people that are looking to scale up their careers, to also solve interesting and challenging problems that they themselves might have in the context of a project that they're working on and things like that. And we're more than happy to try and bring in speakers that that are related to a topic that you yourself want to get a better sense of. So if there's a particular area of blockchain, for example, that's interesting to any of the people that attend the mastermind, we are more than happy to facilitate getting the right speakers in to speak on that topic. So moving forward, in terms of this particular this particular talk, I think the focus of it really is why we built Umeed, what we've done with it, what we plan on doing with it going forward, and how we, from a technology perspective, how it all came together. That's going to be a bulk of the conversation. It goes really without saying that April, May 2021 were arguably the worst months when it came to COVID in India, but more than even that, it was without a doubt one of the more challenging times that India has faced, probably since its independence. More than a third of the total deaths that have happened, I think it's about 450,000 total deaths since the start of the pandemic. More than a third of those happened in those 2 months, April and May alone. The healthcare system was overwhelmed. Last mile logistics were a huge challenge. There was a whole bunch of hoarding of medical supplies going on. There was a black market that had developed for key and essential medical supplies. And that just seemed to be a general sense of panic and hopelessness in that time. So around that time, honestly, in a clubhouse session of all things, we basically came to in some sense a face-to-face with a company called the Sadhana or organization, I should say, called the Sadhana Foundation, which is a 501c3 company in the US, and they were doing some very, very interesting work on the medical side. They were providing medication, they were providing oxygen concentrators, they were helping marginalized communities in different parts of India. They were donating masks. They were doing a ton of different things to help with the pandemic. Alongside that, and they were working hand in hand with an organization called the World Youth Heart Federation. So the Sadhana Foundation is run by Dr. Mamta Sadhana. The World Youth Heart Federation was founded by Dr. Priyansh Shah. And they were both working hand in hand on various initiatives. The World Youth Heart Federation was doing its best to help on the ground, particularly in terms of providing healthcare workers with essentials that they needed to do what they needed to do in order to best serve the public. They were also providing medical advice to patients and caregivers through various social media platforms, from Facebook through to Instagram, through to WhatsApp, and they were working round the clock in terms of providing as much assistance as they could. And the World Youth Heart Federation basically comprised a bunch of really young doctors that had just graduated or were in their final year of med school and things like that. So it was one of those just volunteer efforts that came together with practitioners from different parts of India to try and provide service in a time of desperate need. At that point, one of the things that was brought to our attention, ours being Archimedes, was sort of the gaps that existed with how assistance was being provided, particularly through the social media platforms. So most of the communication was happening through WhatsApp, through Facebook groups, through Instagram. Now there are some significant downsides to all of this, including you needed to have an account in order to be able to access the care. The patients needed an account, as well as the medical practitioners needed an account to be able to connect to each other. There was no anonymity. So if, for example, someone contacted you on WhatsApp, you as a medical practitioner, your contact information was then exposed, and you were basically, people could get in touch with you even for the most trivial of situations at times that didn't make sense. There were no routing rules and things like that either, right? So for example, it didn't matter. It wasn't clear based on what type of route set you would make contact with a particular caregiver. So for example, the same person could have been answering requests for 12 hours, but there was no sort of end of shift other than logging out. But the minute you logged out, how the next contact was handled wasn't very clear. So there were some significant shortcomings in terms of how this type of support was being provided. There were several full-blown telehealth apps that were solving the problem of sort of deep medical intervention, which include things like drug prescriptions, etc. But most of the contacts seem to be related to just basic advice and triage. They weren't about prescriptions and things like that. And there wasn't something that at least when we were doing our initial research that seemed to be catered to, hey, because a lot of the contacts were basically ones that didn't really require significant medical attention. They just needed somebody on the other end to provide them with some basic guidance on what to do next or what not to do, and leave it at that. Right, that handled a lot of the contacts that were happening at that point in time. And full-blown telehealth apps weren't really, sort of, that's not their focus, right? Their focus is to be able to provide full-blown help in an event where somebody needs that help. And so what we were thinking of doing was building a tier that you think of as tier 0 or tier 1 that basically comes in front of these telehealth apps that allows you to do a lot of contact deflection, whereby these telehealth apps don't get overwhelmed with requests that are largely triage or sort of easier to handle, Q&A type requests as it related to COVID. There were some significant constraints that we had to keep in mind of. So first off, time was of the essence. We really needed to put this app out there as quickly as possible. The app needed to be chat or voice recording based. It couldn't be like a full-blown voice or video app, because if that was the case, then it started to fall under the telehealth umbrella itself, which then required various regulatory and legal compliance burdens to be dealt with. And honestly, that would just delay the introduction of an app like this. Anonymity was very important. That was something that the social media platforms were not providing. Ease of use was obviously very important, including the ability to chat in the language that you were most comfortable with, or to be able to type in text in the language that you're most comfortable with. And the app needed to be built in a way where, over the long term, we could maintain this at a very low operational cost, on a very low operational cost basis. And so all of these things had to be taken into account as we were sort of designing, building, and deploying this app. And I'll let sort of Russell take it from here and talk through, how he dealt, and along with a really good team of engineers, across really 2 companies, Archimedes, as well as a bunch of volunteer engineers from ThoughtWorks that helped to make this a reality in very short order. So I'll let Russell talk through how that all came about and what they did to manage some of these constraints. So I'm going to stop sharing, Russell. You can go ahead.
Sure, Sadik. Let me just get the presentation up. Right. So here, hello everyone. I'm Russell. I'm a software developer at Archimedes, and I'm going to start deep diving into this whole part where we had this huge challenge, and we had to use, let's say, unconventional technology to get something done in an extremely short timeline. So let me just get started with the first slide. So I'm just going to quickly recap a couple of the challenges Sadik had mentioned. So as a development team, as well as the design team, we definitely had a lot on our plate at this point to figure out, because of course we needed this app built yesterday, right? So it was something that's extremely important and that we build out as soon as we can. And since it is a chat-based app, this is when we started figuring out, yeah, we're definitely going to require some real-time infrastructure to facilitate chats between the medical volunteer as well as the patient at this point, right? So this is extremely critical and not as easy to do and at scale. So the other point was definitely secure data access, because we are dealing with sensitive information such as patient information. So we don't want to just give access to anybody. So that was extremely important. And the mobile the mobile first approach was extremely important to us because we did not have the time to go through a whole process through the App Store or the Google Play Store where we wait a month or so until they approve the app, and we just didn't have the time. We had to get going from the start, right? And of course, cost was something that we had to bear in mind as well. And the whole point was, let's get the designs ready, let's get it to production in under record time, because we definitely had to move stuff pretty fast so people can get help as soon as possible. So keeping that in mind, it's a good idea to definitely go over what is expected of a production app, and what is definitely some pointers you have to build into almost all production apps. Right, one is good UX and UI. So form and function is extremely important in good production apps, but in the context of Umeed, function took over form. So we had to focus on UX, way more important to us, and we will show you the design in the next few things. And scalability and high availability were extremely important factors, right? Because during the wave, we had lakhs of cases, I mean, hundreds of thousands of cases every day, and we did not know how many people would come to our platform to get help. So we had to build for scale from the start. And we also had to make sure we are available both on the front end as well as on the back end to as many people as available at any point in time, and there's no downtime. So that was a huge ask, and that is not something easy to achieve as well. And of course, security has to be of the highest standard possible. As I had mentioned prior to this, we are dealing with patient data and so on and so forth. So moving on to the cost optimization, we had to obviously keep that in mind. And then CI/CD, where we will definitely have bugs. Humans are writing software at the end of the day, and errors are bound to happen. And how quickly and seamlessly can we implement these fixes is of utmost importance. And of course, performance, and there's a bunch more things which we really can't cover over here. So these are things we had a certain benchmark that we had to keep up to, and we have to make sure we hit all of these, right? There were no compromises at any level, and we had to make sure the app was sturdy and good from the start.
Yeah,
So the first step,
Russ, if you don't mind, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you meant by good UX was more important at some level than good UI here. And not
Sure.
that the UI was bad, but there is a very important distinction to be made there.
Right. So keeping the context of the app itself, people who are coming to the app, we've got to understand why they're coming to the app first, right? The user need at this point is not to see a pretty UI and be like, oh, this is nice, I'm going to use this app. They're purely coming to get help, and they are in a situation where function at this point is way more important than form. And we have to make sure it's as seamless as possible for users to come in without any hassle, get help as soon as they can. For example, inputting the information which we are asking for, as well as the whole chat process for it to be seamless, and there's no huge queue for them to wait on, and so on and so forth, right? So for the user, it should be extremely fast, extremely seamless, and the design does not really take a huge, it doesn't take precedence over the function at this point, because of the way the whole app was structured and the need of the user at this point in time. Okay, so I'm just going to step in. So the first step we definitely had to go through were getting the designs ready, and parallelly there was a bunch of research happening on the kind of tech stack we can use, but I'll just get to that. Let's just jump through the designs here. So I have 4 of the designs, not all of them. So the first design itself is the first page of the information we collect from any patient, because we do definitely need a bunch of information so we can provide it to volunteers who can then get on call and who can then help assist folks. So the second, third screen over here is more or less the login screen, and then you see the list of patients that have currently requested for help, and then you can basically flip the switch on any one of these patients who you feel that you can help at this point in time, and we get into a chat session with them. And this chat session is a live session. There's no lag whatsoever. And you can also upload images, or for example, a prescription, etc., to help get accurate results from your caregiver at this point in time. So largely these were the screens. So this is the whole flow of the screens. And there are many more. I'm just going through 4 of them. So let me just switch to the next one. So at this point, we had to do a bunch of research on the tech part, right? Like, how do we build this whole real-time app with chat? And there's a lot of security to keep in mind. And we have authentication. We need a pretty secure database and all of these things. So it was a little complex, but then we did a bunch of research and eventually we kind of figured a good solution. And of course, there are multi other solutions, but this is one of the solutions we had picked. So we had thought we'd use Google Firebase. So for those of you who don't know what Firebase is basically a backend as a service. It is provided by Google and it is on the Google Cloud platform. And they have a host of different services which we'll end up getting into. So this kind of helped us at a huge level because Firebase kind of offered everything we needed in one place rather than us jumping to multiple different places and getting stuff together. So yep. So let's go through each one of the services and so how just so I can explain how we ended up using each one of them. So the first thing is Cloud Function. So every app at some point will definitely have a backend. And the important thing to keep in mind is that the way Firebase is structured, the point of Firebase is for you to talk from your client or your mobile device, for example, directly to the server. I mean the backend. My bad. So this whole communication happens directly without a middleman in place. So for this to happen, we kind of don't need to write a backend per se, right? Like it talks from your client to your database directly. And this has a few constraints, which we will get to in the next few slides, but largely that's how Firebase works. But there are some situations where you can't really trust a client, right? Because you don't know if the device is compromised, is it hacked, etc. At this point, you need to have a small microservice that kind of facilitates stuff like that. So Cloud Functions by Google Cloud, Google's Firebase is a pretty sweet little tool. This is completely serverless, and it helped us write a small microservice that ended up sending out SMSs using Twilio, of course, to patients so they can join a live chat session and keep everything seamless. So we had to do this on a back end because we can't really trust the client with any sort of secrets, especially sending out emails or SMSs, etc. So that was extremely important. And this is when we ended up using functions in order to break out this one logic out into the backend. So it's all safe and it's not in the open. So the next service we ended up using was cloud storage. So storage generally is used for images, etc. And we definitely had images in chat and we could not just upload anything to a public bucket. It had to be safe. It had to be behind a lock and key and only the authorized personnel eventually get access to it. So Cloud Firestore provides like a wrapper around Google Cloud Storage, and that was extremely important for us because this heavily tied into the Firebase ecosystem. And we ended up using something called security rules, which I will get to soon, for all services in order to make sure they're secure. Data access is secure. So we used cloud storage in order to upload and save our images. So hosting is extremely important. Once we had built out the app, we definitely need a place to keep it up and running at all points in time with the least amount of downtime and something that was cost effective and easy to push out at this level, right? So this is where hosting was provided by Firebase, and we ended up using hosting, which was pretty seamless for us because everything was in one place. So, and the hosting was just the end of our CI/CD pipeline. So it just deployed all the build artifacts directly to Firebase. So the next thing is Cloud Firestore. So Cloud Firestore is a pretty interesting database. It's a NoSQL database, which works in a serverless fashion. So you pay for what you use, which is amazing because that's the exact use case we want. So whenever we have a burst of users or activity, the database is able to handle the load. And when there's a lull in activity, that is when we have everything just being taken care of. Like we're not paying for stuff that's not really being used. But there are certain limitations to a NoSQL database, which obvious, like we don't have ACID compliance, for example, and stuff like that. So we ended up using Firestore in order to save user information to keep all things on record for us to eventually go and check against, as well as for any volunteer to go and get user data so they can help, chat with the patient.
So just very quickly, Russ, in terms of cost, I think everything that we used up to a certain threshold outside of perhaps SMS notifications didn't really have, we're all in the free tier, right? We didn't end up having to pay for anything outside of the SMS notifications, correct?
Exactly. So Firebase comes with a very generous free tier, and this free tier is pretty large for most applications, and We did not cross that threshold until today, in fact. So that's great. So it definitely gives you a low barrier to entry to getting an app out there, as well as it helps you with the cost optimization. And plus, this is serverless. So the whole idea behind that is pay for what is actually being used. It's completely on demand. If nothing is being used, you will not pay for anything. All right, so moving to the next service, Firebase authentication. This is where we needed to authenticate medical volunteers, right? We need to know, is this a legit user who gets access to our user data and who can then action upon stuff? So Firebase authentication was an amazing little service that we could use to give custom roles and stuff to users, so we could identify them, and we had a guarantee that yes, this is the user we can trust and we can give them access. And finally, coming to the last bit of it is the real-time database. So this is what we ended up using eventually to facilitate all the chat functionality, which ended up connecting medical volunteers with all our patients. And this proved to save a lot of time because, again, this is serverless. So we ended up paying for exactly what we used and nothing beyond, as well as the setup for something like this is insanely easy. We just had to use the SDK provided by Firebase, and that was about it. It was extremely less setup. We could get going fast, and this is huge, right? In a space like this, to get a real-time chat app in a short amount of time through services like this is a huge deal. And this definitely was the main factor that really saved a lot of time for us. Cool. So now that we have gone, let me just go back. So now that we have gone over these features, there are much more things that Firebase offers. We have just used 6 of the stuff that Firebase offers, but there are a multitude of other things that Firebase has to offer. Cool. So the next thing was security rules. So data access is extremely important, and we have to tightly control something like that. And especially in a scenario where the client is directly accessing the database, we can't be too sure who's this person, right? We have to make sure the right people have access to the right places. And the way Firebase is set up, like I mentioned, there's no backend in the middle. So how do you really trust the connection? The only way you can do that is through something called security rules. So it's basically a JSON-like object that you write that kind of dictates, it's like a guard, a firewall, if you will, in front of your data that verifies stuff, and only based on what you say will it allow. For example, over here, access is only given to authorized personnel. For example, if a medical caregiver has signed in, they have something called an auth object, right? So we know who this person is, we can identify them, and this is what is eventually transferred onto the backend, which is Firebase basically. And these guys verify and make sure, okay, fine, is this person legit? Do we know who this person is? Is this token valid? And if it's not, let's reject it. If it is valid, that's when we'll give them access. So this rule over here suggests that any authenticated user has read or write access, which is not really safe because you don't want anyone to have read access anywhere. The next rule here is actually a little bit more tightly controlled. So if you're a user who has created this bit of data, you get to either read it or write over here. So this is a little bit more tightly controlled, and we had to make sure we add this to each and every collection in the database. So we make sure that folks who have the right access will see the right things, and no one can just see each and every bit of data. So this is your firewall in front of your database, and you have to configure your security rules to be safe, secure, and you have to test them. Great. So the next thing is something called auth claims, right? So we need to differentiate between users, which is extremely important. We need to know who is a patient, we need to know who is a caregiver, and so on and so forth, or admin, etc. Right? So Firebase auth lets us set something called custom auth claims. And over here, the simple code snippet basically says that this user here has a role of admin, which is as easy as this. We don't need to set up another collection or another database that we save this action, we save this role, and then we check against it. None of those things. All this is kind of inbuilt, and it's in the token, so we can trust this 100% if it is verified by Google that it is going to be the right user with the right role. And so it's extremely important, because if you have all the security rules and you don't have the right roles, nothing really, everything falls apart basically. Cool. So everything looks great on the surface, but of course there are some issues, as this image clearly illustrates. It got me scratching my head for a bit, but this is actually a black and white image, and the artist here has basically just drawn colored lines or the colored grid, and your mind basically fills the rest of it, right? So on first view, it's very nice to look at, and then you kind of realize, oh shit, there's a little bit more to it, right? So keeping that in mind, let's go through the cons. And things are not as great as they seem. There are limitations with any and everything, and of course people have to do their research before they find these things out. The biggest con we see in Firebase or any service like Firebase is a vendor lock-in. So you kind of have to choose, are you ready to go with Google? Are you ready to go with AWS or some other provider? And you kind of stick into that ecosystem because your authentication is there. The way you structure your app's code is in such a way that you're directly communicating with the database, and it is extremely tough to break out of that at some level, wherein you have to change everywhere you call the backend, and it's a hassle. So it's a huge red flag if you are not too keen on working with Google, for example. Vendor lock-in is a huge deal. The second point we saw that was a little bit of an issue, but it wasn't really for our team because we are JavaScript developers and we knew Node.js by default, but the wrapper for functions with Firebase only provides access to Node.js as a language. But if you use the normal Google Cloud functions, that's when you have access to other languages such as Go, Python, etc. And the next thing was the pricing was somewhat complex. And the reason why I'm saying that is, yes, they do provide a generous free tier, but it is extremely hard for you to calculate how many requests you're going to have on average and all these things, right? And the way the pricing is structured, you get a little confused because you're paying X amount for so many reads, so many writes, but what is what, right? It's a little confusing over here. And you can't accurately calculate your price. But that being said, the prices are relatively low as compared to running your own server. So the next point is, this is a NoSQL database, right? And for people who love SQL or need a relational database, this can pose a huge issue because you don't have joins, for example, and there's no ACID compliance. There's a bunch of different things that are kind of missing in a NoSQL database that a SQL database would provide by default. The next thing is, especially if in the US, you have to comply with HIPAA, and the problem here is that not all Firebase products have HIPAA compliance. Google's official document, as I checked today, had only 2 of the Firebase features that were compliant with the HIPAA, and that was the Cloud Functions as well as Cloud Firestore. So the database and the functions basically. But the authentication is not covered with this compliance. And if you want to use that, you should use something called Google Cloud Identity rather than Firebase authentication. So that can definitely pose a big issue. The real-time database does not have this compliance. And that is definitely an issue for most people who are in this space.
So before you jump, just very quickly, in terms of the HIPAA compliance piece, if real-time communicate, is it possible to build HIPAA compliance features on your own on top of Firebase services, even if it's not available out of the box from Google?
So you can get your app compliant, but then the services you are using by default is not compliant. So that would make yours null and void. So that is a bit of an issue, and AWS is strides ahead of Google when it comes to compliance on their apps. And that is one unfortunate thing in Firebase where it is not fully compliant, and you'll have to do your own certification to figure those things out.
So what you're saying is, even if you build your own, if you build HIPAA compliance from the point of view of your application, because the services that are hosting this are not HIPAA compliant, your HIPAA compliance gets superseded and is not considered HIPAA compliant as a whole. Is that correct?
Right. Because if you write everything properly, but the place where you're storing it itself is not compliant, that does not hold, right?
But Firestore is compliant, right?
Firestore is, and Google Cloud Functions is. So if you use only these, you're safe. But if you use real-time database heavily, or you use another service that is not really compliant, that's when you will fall into a couple of issues. And that's when we have to do a little bit more research to figure those things out.
All right, thank you.
No problem, Sadhik. All right, so moving to the next thing. So of course, there are multiple different alternatives, and I put 2 here, but I'll go through one more. So if you're a AWS person, Amplify is a great option. We have used Amplify. We've had a great experience with it. And Amplify gives you a GraphQL endpoint out of the box. So it's pretty cool. And the pricing is very similar to Firebase. They provide all the features which Firebase provides, Amplify provides too. So that's great. but it's just about choosing which platform or cloud provider you really want to go down. And the next thing is some new upcoming thing called Superbase. So they have been a huge success
But
lately.
there
In
was
fact,
a specific reason why we didn't use Amplify, right? Do you recall what that was? Because I know we
it
looked
was
at it at least briefly.
right. So it was mostly because of the whole GraphQL complexity. One part is that if we have some logic that we're going to write, like for example, a custom resolver manually, you can't really write that in JavaScript. You have to learn something called Velocity. It's another language just to go and write the resolvers. And it had a bunch of other little complexities that just kept popping up. And we just figured Firebase is a much faster alternative just to get go and get things rolling.
But from a HIPAA compliance perspective, would Amplify make more sense?
Yes,
If
of course. Most of AWS's products are HIPAA compliant. In fact, Google is too, but certain Firebase products are not. So if that is an issue, AWS is the best bet at this point.
Thank you.
Problem. So the next alternative is Superbase. Superbase is a huge hit lately, like I mentioned, and they recently got funded and stuff, and they call themselves the open source alternative to Firebase, and they're pretty cool. So they do provide almost all options except cloud functions for right now, which is in the works at a slightly different pricing structure and model. But the only difference here is you don't really get the cloud backing from Google, which is all over the world and it's super fast and everything. So you definitely have a little bit of a trade-off over there. But if people prefer using an open source alternative, Superbase is amazing. And the last one we definitely were getting into was something called Realm. It doesn't provide all the services that Firebase, Amplify, or Superbase provides, but it gives you a backend as a service and authentication, but not the storage in terms of bucket storage. But database is definitely there, and it's by MongoDB, and that's been a great alternative as well. So yeah, this is about the way we ended up building everything. And I'm just going to hand this off to Sadek to speak about the next steps and explain some other stuff here. Sadek, you're on mute.
Yeah. So coming back to this from an Umeed perspective, the major reason for us in terms of building out this application this way was also down the line to be able to open source it, because in order to continue maintaining it, we know that it's not going to be continue to be maintained purely through Archimedes developers. We are fine being the maintainers of the code base, but not necessarily doing every feature, every commit, etc. So it's from our perspective, it's going to be important to keep this sort of particularly as a living and breathing app to open source and to build an open source community around the app. So that's one of the items that we have on our agenda as we look forward in terms of the future of this application. The other is around what some of the core features are that we're looking to incorporate. So one of the things that was obvious to us in terms of the use of the app is while it does support text chat, there are a lot of people that do not know how to type in any language. And if you truly want this app to be utilized by everyone and anyone, you have to have a WhatsApp type voice recorded messaging feature, which we don't currently have. And that's something that, as we look at building out this app further, we'll definitely look at doing. There are also certain things that we need to implement in order for the app to be more usable, particularly from the medical volunteer front. So one of the things that we realized, particularly in terms of scaling this becomes an issue, is as we think about the SMS related cost and how notifications would potentially have to be sent out to multiple practitioners all at once, the costs of that, particularly the SMS costs, start to go up exponentially. So one way to avoid that is to have in-app notifications, which unfortunately you can't have without a native app, particularly in iOS. So as we think about how to best make this user-friendly from the point of view of medical practitioners and medical volunteers, it's critical that that it be a native app. So that is another item that we have on our agenda in terms of future enhancements, future changes. We didn't have the time to do that in the context of launching Umeed, primarily because the time frame was very limited. But if there is if we can if we can do this in a more relaxed manner, we do have the ability to get it through the App Store approval process and put the app both on iTunes as well as Google Play. And that would enable us to do a lot of other things, particularly around in-app notifications, maybe even taking advantage of some of the core native features that Apple and Android provide beyond that, which we can't do, it being a web app. Another area that we are looking at is basically in terms of how we looked at the flow of this app. We looked at this as an app that basically provided you with tier 0 and tier 1 assistance, with tier 2, which we think of tier 0 is it generally refers to self-service in a customer contact process. Tier 1 refers to your first human contact. And we look at that as triage. So our goal was to basically provide tier 1 with the original iteration of Umeed, then add on features that allow for tier 2, in particularly some rule-based tier 2, where based on the contact being made and based on certain rules, you can provide feedback to the person making the contact, and they can get some self-service without having to talk to a medical volunteer. What we think of as tier 2 starts to become more full-blown telehealth, which is where you really what we want to really do there is provide integration to other full-blown telehealth applications out there. And full-blown telehealth applications tend to be very country specific. So a full-blown telehealth app in the US, for example, may not be the same as a full-blown telehealth app in India. So it would be important to work with the right partners to provide that integration. But trying to do that within the context of Umeed would be very, very difficult, because we literally have to know each country's rules and regulations, as well as have integrations deeply into the medical system of each country, which would be extremely difficult to do from the point of view of a project to take on and maintain. And finally, we want this app to be flexible enough where, in the case we need to retrofit this app for a different type of medical emergency in a different part of the world, we can do that very easily. None of that's really built into how we've designed it as of now. As of now, it basically was designed for a very specific problem in a very specific geography. But if you were to take the same app and provide it to, even within the context of COVID, to a different geography, we would definitely need to make certain changes. Leave alone if you were to take this app and use it for a different context, say a non-COVID context, and provide it in a completely different geography, then a lot will have to change. In order for an app like this to be a true SOS app that can be applied by Sadhana, who is going to be sort of the owners of this app longer term, they would definitely need to have the flexibility to retrofit it for the emergency that the app is being used in the context of, and that flexibility has to be designed into the app. Of course, there are a lot of things around the HIPAA compliance and things like that that Russell spoke about, and those would have to be dealt with literally on a geography by geography basis. Where is HIPAA compliance critical? Where can we roll out this app? Not necessarily with all of the HIPAA compliance features, but some of the features, and then add our own layers of security and protection on top of that. Even if it's not, quote unquote HIPAA compliant, it does do everything that HIPAA compliance requires us to do. I'll stop there, but that's essentially the end of the presentation. The whole purpose of this presentation was primarily to talk through the context in which this app was built, the constraints under which this app had to be built, and then what we did from an engineering point of view to make this app come alive. So if it is very engineering centric, I realize that, but that's the purpose of these engineering masterminds, is to go into the engineering details of it, and less to talk through some of the more I guess functional aspects of Umeed, for example. So any questions, anything that either Russell or I can answer? I think at this point we'd open it up to Q&A. Okay, there's nothing else, then we will record this session. Well, the session's been recorded. We will put it up on YouTube probably in the next day or two. And if you want to view the recording later on, you'll have the ability to. But if there's any particular area that you need more information on, if it's on the functional side, then you can reach out to me. If it's on the technical side, you can still reach out to me, but I'll probably get the answers that you need from Russell. But more than happy to take any conversations that anyone wants to have off this offline. On the engineering side, particularly for all the engineers on the call, if there's an area that that you folks want to deep dive on, or pick Russell's brain on, I think one of the things that he's gonna start doing not too long from now, we'll start some kind of sort of an office hours, which is be on a periodic basis. You can ask him those questions in those office hours, but more than happy to engage one-on-one between now and when those office hours get set up as well. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for being patient through this. I know it was perhaps too technical in places, but again, that's the purpose of the masterminds, is to try to get to the technical details of how this was implemented, and the solutions that were adopted, and why they were adopted. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.